There's a man sitting alone at a coffee shop reading a book, completely content with his own company. He's not scrolling through dating apps, not desperately seeking validation, not performing for anyone's approval. And this terrifies society more than any rebellion, any protest, any revolution. Why? Because he's discovered something they never wanted him to know. Carl Jung spent decades studying the human psyche and uncovered truths so dangerous that revealing them could collapse the entire social order built around your insecurity. What if I told you that everything you've been taught about being single is a carefully constructed lie, designed to keep you dependent, controllable, and profitable? What if the very thing society calls your greatest weakness is actually your ultimate source of power? Jung discovered that the man who truly understands himself, who has integrated his shadow, who has completed what he called individuation, becomes something society cannot manipulate, cannot control, and cannot break. And they will do anything to prevent you from reaching this state. Stay with me, because what I'm about to reveal will shatter everything you think you know about relationships, success, and what it means to be complete. By the end of this video, you'll understand why they fear the conscious single man more than any army, and why your solitude might be the most revolutionary act you can commit. The first dark secret is that your loneliness is manufactured. Jung understood something that modern psychology refuses to acknowledge. There's a massive difference between solitude and loneliness, but society has deliberately confused these two states to keep you seeking external validation. Loneliness is the painful awareness of disconnection, but here's what they don't tell you. This disconnection isn't from others, it's from yourself. Jung wrote about the process of individuation, becoming conscious of your unconscious patterns, integrating your shadow, discovering your authentic self. When you complete this process, something extraordinary happens. You stop feeling lonely, even when you're alone, because you've reconnected with the most important relationship you'll ever have, the one with yourself. But society profits from your loneliness. The dating industry is worth over $8 billion annually. Social media platforms generate revenue from your desperate need for connection. The self-help industry sells you solutions to problems they helped create. They've weaponized your natural desire for human connection and turned it into a commodity. Jung discovered that what most people call loneliness is actually the psyche's cry for wholeness. But instead of looking inward, society teaches you to look outward. Instead of developing your relationship with yourself, they convince you to seek completion through others. This is the first manipulation, making you believe that being alone equals being incomplete. The truth Jung uncovered is revolutionary. When you develop genuine self-relationship through shadow work, active imagination, and conscious development, you become psychologically complete. Not half of something waiting for your other half, but a whole person capable of choosing relationships from abundance rather than neediness. This completeness is what they fear most, because a complete person cannot be manipulated through their lack. The second secret is that marriage has become society's primary tool for psychological castration. Jung understood that the individuation process requires periods of solitude, self-examination, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths about yourself. But marriage, as currently structured, makes this process nearly impossible. Not because partnership itself is problematic, but because modern marriage has been designed to prevent psychological development. Think about it. The married man must constantly consider another person's emotional state, manage relationship dynamics, compromise his vision through endless negotiation. His energy, which could be directed towards self-understanding and creative expression, gets channeled into maintaining domestic harmony. Jung observed that creativity emerges from tension between conscious and unconscious forces. But marriage often reduces this creative tension by providing external stability that prevents the internal pressure necessary for psychological breakthrough. The single man faces the full weight of existence alone. This isn't punishment, it's the exact condition required for what Jung called the encounter with the unconscious. He must develop his own emotional intelligence, create his own meaning, face his own shadow without being able to project it onto a partner. This direct engagement with psychological reality is what creates genuine strength, authentic confidence, and creative power. Society fears this development because the individuated man cannot be controlled through conventional means. He doesn't need approval, doesn't require external validation, doesn't seek completion through others. He's become what Jung called a free individual, and free individuals are dangerous to systems built on psychological dependency. The third secret reveals how society has weaponized your sexuality against your psychological development. Jung understood that sexual energy, what he called libido, is fundamentally creative life force. But modern culture has corrupted this understanding, teaching you that sexual desire must immediately seek external expression through relationships. This is a catastrophic misunderstanding of your own psychological energy. Jung discovered that when sexual energy is consciously directed, it transforms into creative power. This process, which alchemists called sublimation, allows you to channel your most potent life force toward self-development, creative expression, and psychological integration. But society needs you to believe that sexual energy requires immediate external release. Why? Because sexually desperate men make terrible decisions. They compromise their values, sacrifice their goals, and abandon their authentic path in pursuit of sexual validation. The man who has learned to work with his sexual energy consciously, rather than being driven by it unconsciously, develops extraordinary personal power. He can channel this energy toward building businesses, creating art, developing wisdom, or any pursuit that serves his authentic development. This doesn't mean sexual repression, which Jung warned against. It means conscious relationship with your own life force. When you understand that sexual energy is creative energy, you stop being controlled by your desires and start using them as fuel for your transformation. Society desperately wants to prevent this understanding because a man who masters his own energy cannot be manipulated through sexual scarcity or the promise of sexual access. The fourth secret is that your need for approval is actually your shadow-seeking integration. Jung discovered that what we reject about ourselves gets projected onto others, creating endless cycles of seeking validation for the parts of ourselves we've disowned. Most men seek approval from women to validate their masculinity, but this creates a devastating psychological split. You begin to perform masculinity rather than authentically expressing it. The shadow contains everything society taught you was unacceptable about being male. Your aggression, your selfishness, your desire for dominance, your refusal to sacrifice for others. But these aren't negative qualities that need to be eliminated. They're aspects of your psyche that need to be consciously integrated. When you own your shadow completely, something remarkable happens. You stop needing external validation because you've validated all aspects of yourself internally. You're no longer performing goodness to prove you're worthy of love. You're simply whole. The man who has integrated his shadow becomes authentically confident rather than compensatory confident. He doesn't need to prove his worth because he's faced and accepted his unworthiness. He doesn't need to demonstrate his strength because he's acknowledged his weakness. This integration creates genuine power that cannot be shaken by others' opinions or approval. Society fears shadow integration because it creates men who cannot be shamed, guilted, or manipulated through their disowned aspects. When you own everything about yourself, others lose the ability to control you through your unconscious blind spots. The fifth secret reveals that consumer culture is specifically designed to prevent your psychological development. Jung understood that individuation requires facing what he called the dark night of the soul, periods of emptiness, meaninglessness, and existential crisis that ultimately lead to psychological rebirth. But consumer culture provides endless distractions that prevent this necessary confrontation with emptiness. Every time you feel the void opening up, society offers you something to buy, someone to date, some experience to consume. This prevents the descent into unconsciousness that Jung identified as essential for psychological development. The single man has fewer buffers against existential crisis. He can't distract himself with relationship drama, family responsibilities, or the constant activity that marriage often provides. This forces him to confront fundamental questions about meaning, purpose, and identity that married men often avoid through external busyness. Jung discovered that these periods of emptiness, while uncomfortable, are actually initiations into deeper levels of consciousness. But you can only navigate them successfully if you stop running from them through consumption, relationships, or other forms of psychological avoidance. The individuated man learns to sit with emptiness, explore meaninglessness, and allow psychological death to occur naturally. From this death comes rebirth into a more authentic and powerful version of himself. Society desperately wants to prevent this process because the reborn individual cannot be controlled through the same mechanisms that control the psychologically undeveloped. He's discovered that meaning comes from within, happiness is internally generated, and completion doesn't require external acquisition. The sixth secret is that society has inverted the relationship between strength and vulnerability. Jung understood that genuine strength emerges from conscious relationship with your own weakness, fear, and limitation. But modern masculinity teaches you to hide these qualities, creating a performance of strength that's actually profound weakness. The single man who has done psychological work learns something revolutionary. Acknowledging your vulnerability doesn't make you weak, it makes you honest. Facing your fears doesn't make you cowardly, it makes you conscious. Accepting your limitations doesn't make you inferior, it makes you real. This authentic relationship with your own human frailty creates unshakable strength because it's based on truth rather than performance. You're no longer afraid of being exposed because you've already exposed yourself to yourself completely. Jung called this the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposites in consciousness simultaneously. Strong and weak, confident and uncertain, powerful and vulnerable. This integration creates psychological flexibility that performance-based masculinity cannot match. The man performing strength becomes rigid, brittle, and ultimately fragile because his identity depends on maintaining an image. But the man who has integrated his vulnerability becomes genuinely strong because his identity is based on authenticity rather than appearance. Society fears this authentic strength because it cannot be broken through the usual methods of attack. You can't shame someone who already knows his shame. You can't expose someone who has already exposed himself. You can't weaken someone whose strength is based on acknowledged weakness. The seventh secret reveals that your independence is actually preparation for conscious interdependence. Jung understood that healthy relationships require two complete individuals choosing connection, not two incomplete halves seeking completion. But society teaches the opposite, that you should seek relationships from neediness rather than wholeness. The single man who uses his solitude for psychological development learns something crucial. He discovers his capacity for genuine independence, emotional self-regulation, and autonomous decision-making. This isn't selfishness, it's psychological maturity. When you can genuinely be alone without being lonely, provide for your own emotional needs, and create meaning independently, you become capable of what Jung called conscious relationship. You can choose partnership from abundance rather than scarcity, strength rather than weakness, wholeness rather than neediness. Most relationships fail because they're attempts by incomplete people to use each other for psychological completion. But the individuated man enters relationships as a complete person who can offer genuine partnership rather than seeking completion. Society fears this understanding because it changes the entire dynamic of human relationships. When men stop seeking women to complete them and start choosing women to complement them, the power balance shifts dramatically. Women can no longer control men through their incompleteness because these men have achieved psychological independence. This creates the possibility for relationships based on mutual growth rather than mutual dependency, conscious choice rather than unconscious compulsion. The eighth secret is that society has weaponized your competitive instincts against your own development. Jung understood that healthy competition serves evolutionary purposes, but modern culture has corrupted this into endless status competition that prevents authentic achievement. The single man often falls into the trap of competing with married men by trying to prove that his lifestyle is superior. But this misses Jung's deeper insight about individuation. Your path is unique. Comparing your journey to others prevents you from discovering your authentic direction. The truth is that some men are meant to be single during certain phases of their development. Others are meant to find partnership early. Some need multiple relationships to understand themselves. Others need solitude for creative work. Jung called this your individual path of development, and it cannot be determined by social norms or comparative analysis. When you stop competing with others and start comparing yourself only to who you were yesterday, everything changes. Your energy shifts from proving yourself to improving yourself. Your focus moves from external validation to internal development. Your goals become authentic expressions of your nature rather than reactions to others' achievements. Society wants you trapped in competitive comparison because it keeps you externally focused and internally undeveloped. The man who drops out of status competition and pursues his individual path of development becomes dangerous because he's no longer controlled by social pressure or peer comparison. The ninth secret reveals that your solitude is actually preparation for leadership. Jung understood that leaders emerge from individuals who have completed their own psychological development first. But society teaches you that leadership comes from social skills, networking, and people-pleasing. This creates leaders who are actually followers, dependent on others' approval for their direction. The single man who uses his alone time for self-development learns something crucial about authentic leadership. He discovers that real influence comes from inner authority rather than external position. When you've faced your own shadow, integrated your personality, and discovered your authentic values, you naturally become someone others want to follow. Not because you're trying to lead, but because you embody qualities that inspire others. Jung observed that unconscious people are attracted to conscious people, like moths to light. The man who has done his psychological work emanates a quality of presence that others find compelling. He's not performing leadership, he's simply being authentic, and authenticity is naturally attractive. This creates what Jung called natural authority, influence that doesn't depend on titles, positions, or social manipulation. Society fears this kind of leadership because it cannot be bought, controlled, or directed by external authorities. The man with inner authority follows his own compass and inspires others to find theirs, rather than following prescribed directions. The 10th and most dangerous secret is that your completeness threatens the entire economic system. Jung understood that the individuation process creates people who need very little to be happy. They've discovered that satisfaction comes from internal development rather than external acquisition. This realization is economically catastrophic for a system built on manufactured dissatisfaction. The psychologically complete man doesn't need to buy things to feel valuable, pursue expensive experiences to feel alive, or acquire status symbols to feel worthy. He's discovered that genuine satisfaction comes from creative expression, meaningful work, authentic relationships, and continuous learning. None of these require significant financial investment. When you realize that happiness is internally generated, you stop being a profitable consumer. You buy what you need rather than what you want. You invest in experiences that serve your development rather than your image. You choose quality over quantity in all areas of life. This shift in consumption patterns would crash the current economic system if it became widespread. Society depends on your psychological incompleteness to drive consumption, your insecurity to fuel spending, your neediness to generate profit. The man who has achieved psychological wholeness through Jungian individuation becomes economically independent in the deepest sense. Not just financially independent, but psychologically independent from the need to consume for emotional satisfaction. This independence represents the ultimate threat to a system built on your dependence. Here's what changes when you understand these 10 secrets. You stop being controlled by social pressure because you've developed internal authority. You stop seeking completion through others because you've discovered your own wholeness. You stop consuming to fill psychological voids because you've learned to generate satisfaction internally. You stop competing for external validation because you've found internal validation. You stop performing strength because you've developed authentic strength. You stop avoiding solitude because you've learned to transform it into creative power. You stop fearing independence because you've discovered it leads to conscious interdependence. You stop being manipulated through your sexuality because you've learned to channel sexual energy consciously. You stop needing approval because you've integrated your shadow completely. And you stop being profitable to systems that depend on your psychological incompleteness because you've achieved what Jung called the goal of human development, becoming who you truly are. This transformation doesn't happen overnight. It requires what Jung called the courage to be yourself in a world constantly trying to make you someone else. It demands facing uncomfortable truths about yourself that society taught you to avoid. It necessitates periods of solitude that others will call selfish or abnormal. But the result is extraordinary. You become psychologically free, authentically powerful, and genuinely complete. Not because you've acquired something external, but because you've developed something internal. And that internal development cannot be taken away, controlled, or manipulated by external forces. This is why they fear the conscious single man. Not because he rejects relationship, but because he chooses it from strength rather than weakness. Not because he avoids responsibility, but because he takes responsibility for his own psychological development first. Not because he's selfish, but because he understands that the greatest gift you can give others is your own completeness. The question isn't whether you should be single or married. The question is whether you'll use your current circumstances, whatever they are, for psychological development or psychological avoidance. Will you face the work of individuation or remain psychologically dependent on external validation? Will you develop authentic strength or continue performing borrowed strength? Will you discover your completeness or keep seeking it through others? Your answer determines not just your personal happiness, but your contribution to human consciousness itself. Because every person who completes the individuation process makes it easier for others to find their own path to psychological freedom. And psychological freedom, Jung understood, is the foundation of all other forms of liberation.